The chamber was oppressively silent. Captain Elias Vance sat at the head of a polished obsidian table, hands clasped, eyes scanning the gathered representatives of the Galactic Union. Across from him, Ambassador Zilvar, a creature of liquid silver and shifting eyes, spoke in the slow, deliberate cadence of the weary. The Union finds itself at war, Zilvar intoned. The Zeldar have rejected diplomacy and begun their conquest. We have no military. Our laws forbid aggression. A pause, then the slightest ripple of apprehension in the ambassador's liquid form. Thus, we turn to you reluctantly. Elias smirked. Reluctantly, a smaller delegate, a reptilian bureaucrat named Vaktal, hissed. We are not fools, human. We know your kind's capabilities. There is a reason galactic law explicitly prohibits your species from waging war. You do not simply win battles. You make war an extinction event. A murmur of assent passed through the delegates. The room smelled of ozone and apprehension. Elias leaned back, amused. I assume you'd rather not be conquered, he said, tilting his head. Zilvar exhaled, a shimmering sigh. Correct. Elias folded his arms. Then let's be clear. If we do this, it'll be our way. The hesitation in the chamber was palpable, but after a long moment, Zilvar gave a solemn nod. Then humanity is hereby authorized to neutralize the Zeldar threat, under the condition that you do not engage in open warfare. Elias smiled. Who said anything about war? The crew, back on the Erebus. The ship hummed with quiet energy as Elias strode onto the bridge. His team had gathered, each seated at their usual posts, waiting. Dr. Mira Patel, the ship's chief engineer, leaned against a console, arms crossed. Let me guess. The Union's desperate enough to let us handle things. Elias settled into his chair, watching as the words sank in. Jonah Park, the ship's historian and resident idealist, grinned. I told you they'd come crawling back eventually. You also told me last week that Venusian tea has medicinal properties. Mira shot back. Jonah shrugged. I stand by both statements. In the far corner, Rico Morales, their wild-card smuggler and general nuisance, kicked his boots onto the table, chewing on a stem stick. So what's the job? Grand heist? Political coup? Hostile takeover? He waggled his eyebrows. Or all three? Elias clasped his hands together. The Zeldar, warrior race, ruthless, highly aggressive, and currently bulldozing their way through Union space. Mira whistled. Big problem. Bigger than that. Elias leaned forward. The Union expects us to fight them. They don't realize we don't need to. Jonah sat up, intrigued. What's the plan? Elias tapped the table. A holographic projection of the Zeldar homeworld materialized, a storm-racked planet of shifting terrain and violent energy surges. We don't fight the Zeldar, he said. We fight their expectations. The mission briefing. Mira zoomed in on the hologram, analyzing the data. The Zeldar homeworld is a nightmare. Unstable magnetic fields, acid rain, gravity fluctuations. Even they struggle to control it. Elias nodded. Exactly. They win battles through brute force. They don't think like us. He turned to Jonah. You know their culture better than anyone. What's their weakness? Jonah rubbed his chin. Honor. The Zeldar see combat as sacred, a proving ground. If they lose a battle, it's not just a setback. It's a stain on their species. Then we make them lose in the worst way possible. Elias smirked. Rico grinned. Psychological warfare. My favorite. Mira raised an eyebrow. We're going to war without actually fighting? Exactly, Elias said. We hit their supply chains, make them think their own forces are betraying them, twist their traditions against them. They'll unravel before they even realize what's happening. Jonah exhaled, impressed. So instead of brute force, we use misdirection and sabotage. Turn their own paranoia against them. Elias met each of their eyes in turn. We're not just going to stop this war. We're going to make the Zeldar surrender themselves. The crew exchanged glances. Then Rico chuckled. Oh, I love this job. Final preparations. As the Erebus departed Union space, The mission set in motion. Mira found Elias on the observation deck, staring at the endless void. She leaned beside him. You know they'll rewrite the laws after this, right? He smirked. Let them. They fear us for a reason, Elias. Her voice softened. Maybe they're right to. He turned gaze steady. Then we give them a reason to never forget. The stars stretched before them, an open path to an unwinnable war. And humanity was about to win it anyway. The Erebus emerged from slip space above Zeldar Prime, a world that looked as hostile as its inhabitants. Thunderstorms raged across vast, jagged continents, their flashes illuminating the swirling green oceans below. The planet's magnetic fields distorted sensor readings, and gravity fluctuations made orbital stability a challenge. It was a battlefield sculpted by nature itself. Elias stood on the bridge, watching the storm-racked planet rotate beneath them. All right, he said, let's ruin someone's day. Mira adjusted the ship's stabilizers. Sensors are barely holding. The planet's a mess, but that works in our favor. Jonah, poring over the latest intelligence reports, frowned. Zeldar forces are concentrated around their War Council's command center. Their entire strategy relies on centralized leadership. If we make them doubt it. Rico leaned back in his chair, grinning. They collapse under their own paranoia. Elias smirked. Let's get to work. The first move. The Zeldar expected an enemy fleet. They got silence. For 3 days, the Erebus remained unseen, running low-emission scans, tapping into Zeldar comms, and studying their patterns. The warriors were growing restless, confused by the lack of direct confrontation. Their battle-ready fleet loomed in the skies, but with no enemy to fight, tension simmered. Then, the first crack appeared. A seemingly routine supply convoy, 3 heavy freighters carrying munitions, vanished. No explosions, no distress signals, just gone. The Zeldar commander scrambled for answers, but their own sensor interference made tracking impossible. Then came the whispers. A low-frequency signal, faint but deliberate, began broadcasting across Zeldar military channels. A message in their own guttural language. The enemy is within. The dishonored rise. Confusion turned to suspicion. Commanders began second-guessing orders. Soldiers eyed each other warily. And as paranoia festered, Elias and his team prepared the next strike, breaking the chain of command. Mira crouched over a console in the Erebus's engineering bay, fingers flying across the interface. We've hacked into their fleet's command relays. I can inject falsified orders, but we have to be subtle. Jonah, standing beside her, nodded. We don't need them to think we're attacking. We need them to believe they are turning against each other. Elias folded his arms. So let's make them question everything. They began small. Slight delays in message transmissions, altered wording in command directives, subtle inconsistencies that made officers doubt their superiors. Then they escalated. A Zeldar dreadnought was instructed to relocate to a different sector, except no such order had been given. Another squadron received conflicting coordinates, sending them into the path of an energy storm. Soon, Zeldar warlords were shouting across comms, each convinced the others were sabotaging them. And then, at the height of confusion, Rico delivered the finishing blow. The Ghost Fleet. With Myra's expertise and Rico's flair for deception, they fabricated a fleet. Using falsified sensor data, they made it appear as though a massive armada, dozens of human warships, had just entered the system. The Zeldar, already primed for betrayal, detected the phantom ships and panicked. This is cruel, Jonah murmured, watching from the bridge. This is efficient, Elias corrected. Across the Zeldar ranks, warlords screamed for reinforcements. Some ships opened fire on empty space, their paranoia overriding discipline. Others, convinced their rivals had led them into a trap, turned on their own. Zeldar Prime descended into chaos. The aftermath. Hours later, the Zeldar High Command transmitted an emergency ceasefire request directly to the Galactic Union. They're folding, Mira said, shaking her head. They don't even realize they never fought an actual battle. Elias exhaled. Because they didn't fight a battle. They lost a war they started against themselves. Rico chuckled. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why they don't let humans fight. The Erebus watched from orbit as the Zeldar's war machine imploded. Their leadership fractured beyond repair. Elias turned to his crew, his smirk returning. And we're just getting started. The Zeldar homeworld teetered on the edge of collapse. Their once unbreakable war machine had turned against itself, and paranoia ran rampant. Some commanders abandoned their posts, convinced they were pawns in a grand betrayal. Others launched desperate offensives against their own strongholds, believing the enemy had already infiltrated them. Elias and his crew watched from the bridge of the Erebus, the chaos unfolding in real time. Rico let out a low whistle. We've done some crazy things before, but this is beautiful. Jonah, arms crossed, sighed. It's horrifying. A civilization collapsing under the weight of its own fears. Elias leaned forward, and we're about to push it over the edge. The challenge. Despite their unraveling command structure, the Zeldar weren't completely broken. Their high warlord Jektrax had consolidated his remaining forces in the planet's capital, rallying his most loyal warriors for a last stand. The problem? Zeldar never surrendered. Even in total defeat, they fought to the death. If Jektrax held the line, the survivors would regroup. In a few years, they'd rebuild and come back stronger. They needed a final, decisive blow. They need to surrender on our terms, Elias said, pacing. We have to make it their idea. Jonah hesitated. That's impossible. Their honor code won't allow it. Elias smirked. Then we break the code. Rewriting tradition. The Zeldar revered war, but more than that, they revered victory. Losing a battle was shameful, but losing a war with no clear enemy? Unthinkable. Mira, deep in thought, pulled up records of Zeldar dueling traditions. There's one loophole, she said. Their warlords can be challenged, but the duel doesn't have to be a fight to the death. The challenger names the terms. Elias grinned. And if I challenge Jektrax and win? Jonah's eyes widened. By their own laws, he'd be forced to step down. And since their leadership is built on strength, Mira finished the thought. His entire army would be obligated to obey you. Rico cackled. So we don't just win. We make their leader surrender himself. The duel that wasn't. Jektrax, bloody but unbowed, stood atop the blackened ruins of his war council chamber, surrounded by his remaining warriors. When Elias stepped onto the battlefield alone, unarmed, the Zeldar warlord let out a guttural laugh. You dare challenge me? A human? Elias smirked. I do. The warriors murmured, shifting uncomfortably. The challenge had been issued. Honor demanded it be met. Jektrax bared his fangs. Name the terms of this duel, and we shall end this properly. Elias took a step forward. Rock, paper, scissors, silence. Jektrax blinked. What? Elias held up a fist. Simple game. 3 choices. Rock beats scissors. Scissors beats paper. Paper beats rock. Best out of 3 wins. The Zeldar warlord looked at his warriors, expecting outrage. Instead, they stood in stunned silence. The challenge had been made. Honor dictated it be accepted. Jektrax growled. Fine. They played. Elias threw paper. Jektrax, instinctively choosing strength, threw rock. Paper covers rock. Elias said, 1 for me. The second round. Elias threw scissors. Jektrax, overcorrecting, threw paper. Scissors cut paper. That's 2. A hush fell over the battlefield. The warlord of an entire species had just been outmaneuvered in a game he didn't understand. Jektrax's fists clenched. His warriors watched, awaiting his decision. Honor demanded he step down. With a low snarl, he turned and knelt, slamming a fist to the ground. By the laws of the Zeldar, I yield. The war was over. The aftermath. Hours later, the Galactic Union received word. The Zeldar had unconditionally surrendered. Not a single shot had been fired. Elias and his crew stood aboard the Erebus, watching the chaos settle into uneasy silence. Mira shook her head. You beat an entire warlord empire with a children's game. Jonah let out a breathless laugh. They'll never live this down. Rico grinned. And this is why they don't let humans fight. Elias smirked. We never fought. We just won. The Zeldar War had ended without a single human casualty. Across the galaxy, news spread like wildfire. An empire built on conquest had collapsed without a single battle. Some species celebrated the end of the Zeldar threat. Others whispered in hushed tones, terrified of what it meant, because it wasn't fleets of warships or planet-cracking weapons that had won the day. It was humans, and humans didn't fight wars. They ended them. Uneasy celebrations. On board the Erebus, the victory felt strangely hollow. No grand parades awaited them. No banners hung in their honor. Rico leaned back in his chair, tossing a stress ball against the bulkhead. We just pulled off the greatest military heist in history, and all we get is radio silence. Jonah rubbed his temples. They don't know how to react. The Zeldar were the galaxy's nightmare, and we just proved that nightmare could be dismantled with a few well-placed nudges. We've broken the rules of war. Mira, arms crossed, frowned. It's more than that. Every species out there has some kind of war history. Victories, defeats, strategies. We just showed them that their way of thinking is outdated. That's not just unsettling. That's dangerous. Elias exhaled. Yeah, and we just became the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The Union's verdict. When the Erebus arrived at Union Prime, they were met with an immediate summons. The Galactic Council chambers, normally filled with polite debate and diplomatic maneuvering, were silent as Elias and his crew entered. Ambassador Zilvar, their gelatinous form shifting uneasily, addressed them first. Captain Vance, you have done what no civilization has achieved in millennia. You ended a war without engaging in battle. Elias nodded. You're welcome. Vaktal, a high-ranking reptilian diplomat, narrowed his yellow eyes. You misunderstand. This is not a moment of celebration. Jonah raised an eyebrow. We just saved billions of lives. Zilvar's voice turned grave. Yes, and in doing so, you have terrified the galaxy. Elias exchanged a glance with Mira, who sighed. Let me guess. They're not afraid of what we did. They're afraid of what we could do. Vaktal's tongue flicked. Precisely. The Zeldar were an existential threat, but they were predictable. They waged war as all species do, with armies, fleets, and brute force. But you rewrote the battlefield. You turned war into an equation only your species can solve. Rico whistled. So, let me get this straight. We didn't kill anyone. We saved everyone. And now we're the bad guys? Zilvar's form rippled with what might have been frustration. You are not the enemy. But you have proven that if humanity ever decided to engage in warfare, it would be unlike anything the galaxy has ever known. Jonah exhaled. So what? You're banning us from fighting. Vaktal nodded. Effective immediately. Galactic law has been amended. Humanity is permanently prohibited from engaging in war, directly or indirectly. The silence stretched. Rico cackled. Well, that's a hell of a thank you. Myra's expression darkened. And if we don't agree? Zilvar's voice softened. Then the Union will have no choice but to consider humanity an uncontrollable variable, one that must be contained. Elias studied them, then sighed. You really think that'll stop us? Vaktal's gaze hardened. We hope it will. Back on the Erebus, the crew sat in the dim glow of the observation deck, watching the Union fleet patrol the station. Even in peacetime, humanity was being watched. Jonah shook his head. We just saved the galaxy, and now we're treated like a superweapon on standby. Mira drummed her fingers against the railing. They don't get it. We don't need war to win. Elias smirked. Exactly. Rico stretched. So what's the next move, boss? Elias turned to the stars, a gleam of mischief in his eyes. Simple. We do what we do best. Jonah sighed. Which is? Elias grinned. Break the rules. Epilogue, the legend begins. The official galactic records would note that humanity had been permanently banned from war. What they wouldn't record was what happened after. Because when wars erupted, when impossible odds threatened civilizations, when problems had no solutions, somehow humans would always be there, not as soldiers, not as conquerors, but as something far, far worse. The ones who win